There's a specific kind of silence that falls over a starting line right after something goes wrong. Officials frozen, staring at each other instead of the car, because what they just watched wasn't supposed to be possible under the rules they'd written that same morning. Most racing rules get written calmly, in an office, months before a season starts. These 10 didn't. Every single one exists because a car, on a specific day, did something so dangerous that NHRA had no choice but to rewrite the rulebook on the spot, sometimes within days of a driver nearly losing his life in front of a full grandstand. And by the time we hit number 1, you'll understand why that car doesn't just top this list. It's the reason every top-fuel dragster on Earth is built the way it is today. Number 10. The 1965 altered wheelbase factory experimental cars. Picture a 1965 Dodge Coronet or Mercury Comet, but with the front wheels pushed forward by as much as 10 or 15 inches, and the rears tucked in tighter underneath. From a distance in the pits, it still looked like a car you could buy off a dealer lot. Up close, it looked wrong in a way most fans couldn't immediately articulate. The proportions were off, like someone had stretched a photograph slightly out of shape, the wheels sitting in places your eye insisted they shouldn't be. Ford and Chrysler both pursued this modification at almost exactly the same time, chasing better weight transfer off the line by shifting mass toward the rear tires under hard acceleration. Nobody had written a rule against altering a wheelbase by more than a couple of inches, because nobody had ever needed to before. That's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. This wasn't a loophole some crafty mechanic dug up after years of studying the rulebook. It was a gap so obvious nobody had thought to close it, because nobody had imagined a team would ever push that far. It's the kind of blind spot that only exists for a brief window in any sport's history, right before someone proves it's there. The result was cars launching with the front end climbing skyward on nearly every single pass, sometimes staying airborne for 30 or 40 feet before the front tires touched back down. Now think about what that actually means for a moment. A car with no front wheels on the ground has no steering input at all. None. If that car drifts even a few degrees offline during those 30 or 40 airborne feet, there is nothing the driver can do about it until the front tires come back down. And by then, at well over 100 miles an hour, a few degrees of drift has already become several feet of lateral movement toward a guardrail packed with spectators who came expecting a race, not a near miss. Officials watching these launches understood immediately what that meant, and within a single season, NHRA was forced to draw a boundary these cars had already blown straight past. Picture the meetings this must have caused grown men who'd spent their careers writing careful, methodical rulebooks, suddenly forced to admit that an entire dimension of the sport had evolved past their control in a matter of months, with no clean way to legislate it after the fact without gutting an entire class overnight. But here's the twist. Nobody saw coming. And we'll come back to it properly at the very end of this list. The emergency scramble to regulate wheelbase alterations didn't kill this style of racing. It accidentally created an entirely new category of it, one that's still one of the biggest draws in the sport today. Keep that thread in your mind. It matters more than it seems right now. Number 9. Dyno Don Nicholson's acid-dipped Ford Maverick. By the early 1970s, teams were dipping steel body panels in acid vats to shave weight, a legal trick if you didn't push it too far. The chemistry itself wasn't complicated. The same basic process used industrially to strip and thin sheet metal, but the judgment call of exactly how long to leave a panel in the tank was where things got genuinely dangerous. Leave it in too short, you've barely saved any weight at all. Leave it in too long, and the acid doesn't stop eating just because you'd like it to. The story that's followed Don Nicholson for 50 years involves a Maverick body that reportedly came out of the tank so thin in places, the roof, sections of the pillars, that some who've told the story swear you could see daylight through it if you held the panel up at the right angle. Not thin like a lighter gauge steel, thin like something that shouldn't legally be called a body panel anymore, more foil than fender. Officials weighed the car, remeasured it, and found nothing technically illegal, because no minimum thickness rule existed yet. Picture the frustration in that moment. A group of trained inspectors standing there with a tape measure and a scale, both instruments telling them everything checked out, while their own hands were telling them something completely different every time they touched the sheet metal. That's a specific, uncomfortable kind of doubt. Your instruments say legal. Your fingertips say something is very wrong here. What terrified officials wasn't just the competitive advantage. It was the safety implications sitting underneath it. A body panel thinned to nearly nothing isn't just light. It's structurally compromised, and a car built that way meeting a guardrail at speed or another car in a collision was a genuinely frightening thought for anyone responsible for driver safety. Within a few seasons, minimum panel thickness requirements appeared in the rulebook, closing a gap that one Maverick had exposed completely. And Nicholson never once publicly confirmed exactly how far he'd actually gone. He just let the legend do the talking for him, the way the smartest people in this sport always seem to. And here's where this list starts to shift, because those two cars only threatened the drivers strapped inside them. The next entries didn't just endanger the people in the cockpit, they started threatening everyone standing on the other side of the guardrail. The people who'd bought a ticket expecting to watch, not to become part of the story. Number 8. The wheelie bar era pro stock cars of the early 1970s. As teams chased better weight transfer, front ends started lifting higher and staying airborne longer, some cars running meaningful stretches of the quarter mile on the rear wheels alone. Wheelie bars scraping the pavement as the only thing keeping the entire car from flipping over backward in front of a packed grandstand. Picture that image for a second. A multi-thousand-pound race car, balanced entirely on two rear tires at triple-digit speeds, with nothing but a metal bar dragging along the ground, preventing it from somersaulting into the crowd. It made for an unbelievable show, and crowds loved it enough that track promoters quietly encouraged it rather than discouraged it. Nothing sold tickets quite like the promise that a car might try to flip itself end over end and just barely fail to. That's the uncomfortable truth buried in this entry. The danger wasn't a side effect nobody wanted for a while. It was part of the appeal, and that's exactly what made it so hard for officials to shut down quickly. How do you regulate away the exact thing that's filling your grandstands? But a car with no front wheel contact has no steering input if it starts to drift, and more than one run during this era ended with a car drifting toward the guardrail, while the driver could do little more than hold on and hope the front end came back down before the track ran out of racetrack. Wheelie bar length and geometry restrictions followed soon after, specifically written to let these launches stay spectacular without letting them tip into genuinely unrecoverable territory. A rule born directly out of officials watching a spectacle edge closer and closer to a disaster they didn't want to have to explain to a grandstand full of eyewitnesses, or worse, to a family sitting in the front row. Number 7. Bill Jenkins' loophole built Vega. Jenkins found gaps in pro stock's weight and engine placement rules that nobody else had noticed, and built a Vega around them that simply out-accelerated the entire field. It wasn't illegal. That was the most frustrating part for everyone racing against him. It was smarter than the rulebook. Officials inspected the car repeatedly, and every single time it came back clean, sending rival crew chiefs back to their own garages with nothing but a growing sense that they'd lost to a mind, not a machine. What terrified officials here wasn't a safety concern in the traditional sense. It was something arguably more unsettling for the people in charge of the sport. It was the realization that their own rulebook had been read more carefully and more cleverly by a competitor than by the very people who'd written it. That's a different kind of fear entirely. It's the fear of losing control of your own document, of watching a driver find a hole in something you spent months drafting and thought was airtight. Officials closed the specific loopholes almost as fast as they identified them, tightening weight distribution and engine placement language in the seasons that followed. But by then, the Vega had already rewritten what a competitive pro stock launch was supposed to look like, and every builder in the class spent years trying to catch up to a standard one very sharp mind had already set alone. In a garage, nobody else had bothered to think that hard in. Every car so far scared officials because of what it could do on a good run. Now buckle up, because the next 3 scared them because of what happened when things went catastrophically wrong, and one of these stories involves a trick so well hidden that some people still argue about how it worked decades later. Number 6. The 426 Hemi-powered nitro funny cars of the late 1960s, paired with nitromethane fuel running at percentages that would be almost unthinkable by later standards. The Hemi turned into something closer to a controlled explosion than a conventional engine. Funny cars of this era ran fiberglass flip-top bodies over engines pushed to the absolute edge of what the metal could survive, and fires were common enough during this stretch that they became part of the sport's folklore. Cracked blocks, blown head gaskets, superchargers grenading mid-run, all happening at 200 miles an hour, with a driver sitting just feet away from the fireball, wrapped in fire gear that in the earliest years of this era wasn't nearly as advanced as what came later. Some of the era's most famous photographs aren't finish line celebrations. Their cars fully engulfed in flame halfway down the strip, the driver already scrambling out of the cockpit before the car has even rolled to a stop. Safety crews sprinting alongside with extinguishers that always seem to arrive a half-second slower than anyone in the stands would have liked. Crew chiefs of this era have described tuning almost as much by sound as by any gauge, listening for a change in an engine's note that meant something was about to let go, sometimes with only a second or two of warning before it did. Officials spent years chasing this problem in pieces because there wasn't one single fix. Fuel percentage caps came first, then mandatory fire suits, then improved parachute and roll cage requirements that read today like they were written in direct response to a very specific, very literal list of things that had gone wrong on a strip somewhere. Almost every safety rule from this era has an unspoken origin story, and that origin story usually involves a stretcher and a driver who either walked away or didn't. Number 5. The nitrous oxide system nobody could officially prove. By the 1990s, suspicion had built for years that certain pro-stock teams were running hidden nitrous oxide systems, reportedly concealed inside the engine block's water jacket itself, with a spring-loaded valve that only released gas once the engine reached racing temperature, meaning a cold pre-race inspection would find absolutely nothing wrong. Refilling the system allegedly used a charging tool disguised to look exactly like ordinary grease equipment, meaning a crew member could top off a hidden nitrous reservoir in full view of anyone watching, and it would look like routine maintenance, the kind of mundane task that draws zero attention in a busy garage area on a race weekend. Whether or not any specific team was ever formally proven to be running a system like this, the mere plausibility of it terrified officials in a very specific way. It meant their entire inspection process, built around checking a car cold before a run, was fundamentally unequipped to catch a system engineered specifically to stay hidden until the exact moment it mattered most. Think about how deeply unsettling that realization must have been for a group of people whose entire job is verifying a car is legal. Their tools weren't just imperfect, they were, by design, incapable of catching this particular trick even if it was happening directly in front of them, weekend after weekend, in plain sight. The suspicion alone was enough to force NHRA into tightening chain of custody procedures around engines after races, expanding random post-event teardown requirements, and generally treating pro-stock power plants with a level of forensic suspicion that hadn't existed in the sport before. It's one of the rare entries on this list where officials never got a confirmed violation, just enough plausible fear about what they couldn't see to change the rules anyway, which might be the most unsettling outcome of all. Not proof, just enough doubt to force an entire garage area to start acting guilty. And if hidden nitrous terrified officials because they couldn't see it coming, this next entry terrified them for the opposite reason, because it was allegedly happening in plain sight, on national broadcasts in front of millions of people who had no idea what they might be watching. Number 4. John Force and the mid-1990s traction control accusations. By the mid-1990s, rivals had started accusing John Force's team of running a device capable of sensing an impending loss of tire traction and automatically counteracting it, a direct violation of NHRA's long-standing ban on any system that senses tire slip and adjusts on its own. Stop and think about what that accusation actually implies. If true, this wasn't just a rules violation. It would undercut the entire premise that driving skill, not computer assistance, separated the champions from the field in a sport built almost entirely on human reflex and feel. NHRA never proved the accusation and never disqualified force over it. But the mere seriousness of the accusation forced officials to issue and reissue public reminders to the entire Top Fuel and Funny Car garage area that any traction sensing system was strictly prohibited, an unusual step for a sanctioning body to take without ever pointing to a specific confirmed violation. Sometimes the scariest thing for officials isn't catching a cheater. It's realizing they might not have the tools to catch one even if it's happening right in front of them, race after race, in full view of the cameras and every rival crew chief in the building. Number 3. The AA Fuel Dragster wheelstand era. Top fuel dragsters of the 1960s and early 70s, running increasingly aggressive weight distribution to maximize traction, developed a habit of leaving the line with the front wheels several feet off the ground, full wheel stands, sustained for 100 feet or more, the car essentially riding on its rear slicks alone, with a driver whose only real steering input was hope. Spectacular for the crowd, who'd lean forward in their seats every single time a dragster's nose started to lift. Genuinely alarming for anyone responsible for driver safety, since a dragster that comes down even slightly crooked at those speeds has virtually no margin for correction before it's already sideways, or worse. Officials began tightening rules around wheelie bar design and rear-end geometry specifically in response to a string of wheelstand-related incidents during this era. Treating the front wheel off-the-ground spectacle the same way they'd eventually have to treat every other crowd-pleasing but dangerous trend on this list. Allow the show, restrict the danger, and hope the two could coexist without another trip to the hospital. Every entry on this list so far taught officials something the hard way, through a fire, a crash, or a near miss. But nothing on this list forced a faster, more total rewrite of the entire sports design philosophy than what happened at a national event in March of 1970. And before we get there, we need to close the loop we opened all the way back at number 10. Number 2. The 1965 factory experimental funny cars in their final form. Remember the altered wheelbase cars we talked about at number 10? By mid-1965, that phenomenon had outgrown anything resembling a stock-bodied car entirely. Fiberglass panels replaced steel, tube chassis work crept in under production sheet metal. Wheelbases stretched by whatever margin got the best 60-foot time, regardless of what the factory blueprint originally called for. These cars were still wearing Comet, Mustang, and Barracuda badges, but in name only. Underneath, they were purpose-built race machines wearing a factory car's skin like a costume. Fans started calling them funny because they didn't look like the cars in the showroom anymore. Something about the proportions making your eye do a double take even if you couldn't say exactly why. The name was meant half as a joke, tossed around trackside between runs. It stuck harder than anyone who coined it ever expected. NHRA officials found themselves staring at a category that had outgrown every rule written for it, and rather than force it back into an impossible box, they gave it its own box instead. Here's the payoff to the loop we opened at number 10. Funny car became a permanent NHRA class, not because officials planned it that way years in advance, but because one line of terrifying, unrecognizable experimentals made the old rulebook completely obsolete within a single season. The cars that scared officials the most weren't punished into extinction. They were too far ahead of the sport's existing structure to be anything other than absorbed into it, and 60 years later, funny car remains one of the marquee classes in the entire sport, a permanent monument to a rulebook that simply couldn't keep up. Number 1. Don Garlett's front-engine dragster. For the entire first era of Top Fuel racing, nobody seriously questioned the layout of a dragster. The engine sat in front, the driver sat behind it, with little more than a few feet of chassis separating their legs from a spinning aluminum driveshaft running at engine speed. Everyone in the sport understood at some level that this arrangement put the driver in a precarious spot if something failed mechanically. Veteran racers of the era talked about it almost casually in later interviews. The drive shaft was just something you sat next to, the same way you might sit beside a running chainsaw and try not to think about it too hard, and yet nobody moved to change it because it had always been done that way, and it had mostly worked. Then in March of 1970, at a national event, the transmission in Don Garlett's dragster failed catastrophically. The exploding transmission tore through the chassis directly in front of him, and the aftermath cost Garlett's half his right foot. He survived, barely. and only because of how quickly he was pulled from the wreck. But the injury was severe enough that it forced a reckoning the entire sport had been quietly avoiding for over a decade. What happened next is why this sits at number 1 on this entire list. This wasn't a slow, multi-season rule tightening like acid-dipped bodies or wheelie bars. Within a remarkably short window after Garlett's crash, top fuel dragsters across the entire sport shifted to a rear-engine layout, moving the driver in front of the engine instead of behind it. Garlitz himself, still recovering, became one of the loudest voices pushing the change, using his own injury as an argument nobody could talk their way around. When Big Daddy Garlitz, the winningest, most respected name in top fuel, says the layout nearly killed him, the rest of the garage listens in a way it wouldn't for almost anyone else. It's rare in the history of any motorsport for a single moment to force an entire category to redesign itself almost overnight. This is that moment. Every rear-engine top-fuel car built since, every dragster you've ever watched cross a finish line at over 300 miles an hour, owes its layout, in some part, to one transmission failure on one afternoon in 1970, and to one driver who turned his own worst day into the reason nobody else would ever have to go through it the same way again. Here's the pattern running through all 10 of these cars, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before we close this one out. None of them set out to terrify anybody. Every one of them set out to be faster, lighter, or more competitive than the rulebook's original authors had imagined possible, and every single time that happened, officials were left with the same impossible choice: regulate after the fact, once the danger or the exploit had already proven itself in front of a live audience, or leave the gap open and hope nobody pushed it further. Almost every rule sitting in NHRA's modern rulebook exists because something on this list came first and forced the question. Nobody preemptively wrote a minimum body panel thickness before Nicholson's Maverick came out of that acid vat. Nobody wrote traction control language broad enough to cover a hypothetical device before rivals started accusing John Force's team of running one. Nobody moved the driver behind the engine until a transmission explosion made the alternative unthinkable. The rulebook you'd read today is a scar tissue map of every car on this list, and dozens more we didn't have time for, each one terrifying somebody enough to finally act. And that's the uncomfortable truth at the center of this entire sport's history. It was never really the officials writing the rules first, with the racers following along behind them. It was almost always the other way around, a garage full of drivers and engineers pushing an idea until something gave, sometimes literally, and a sanctioning body rebuilding itself, emergency rule by emergency rule, around whatever they'd just proven was possible or survivable, or both. If this kind of deep dive into drag racing's history is your kind of thing, that's exactly what this channel is built around. The stories underneath the record books, the rulings that changed everything, and the drivers who forced them to happen. Let me know down in the comments which one of these 10 scared you the most, and hit subscribe if you want more of this every single week. Thanks for watching.